Hey there, I'm Børge Hansen, CEO of David Horn, and welcome to another exciting episode of Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. Today, we're joined by the amazing Professor Becky Milne, a true pioneer in forensic psychology and a passionate advocate for ethical interviewing practices. Becky shares her experience in transforming police interviews from old-school interrogations to sophisticated interviewing techniques, in particular focusing on children and people in vulnerable situations. Join us as we learn how this groundbreaking work is driving changes around the globe to respect human rights. Let's get started. Good morning, Becky, and good morning, everyone. I'm in Luton, in the David Horn office in Luton, and today I'm here with Becky Milne, Professor of Forensic Psychology from the University of Portsmouth. Becky, you want to give a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me for this wonderful podcast, talking about how we've evolved over time from sort of interrogation to investigative interviewing. So I've been working in this arena for over 30 years. I know, I can't believe time just
Time
flies.
flies. Yeah.
It does fly. For over 30 years. So I started out, actually I do inspirational talks for students, for school children who are doing their sort of higher exams, because I wanted to be an optician.
Okay.
I know, I wanted to be an optician, and I'm lucky I didn't get my grades. So this is what I say to
We are
people.
lucky.
That's what I say to people, please don't stress, and in the days where I was applying for university, to be an optician, you either went to university or you went to polytechnic. And in the polytechnic, that's where it was almost like your backup plan. And my backup plan was psychology, because it was this new sort of science. It
Oh,
wasn't everywhere like it is now. And so luckily I didn't get my grades, and I ended up going to Portsmouth. And the reason I went to Portsmouth is because I wanted to do a year out, and I worked as an aid worker over in Ethiopia. Um, it was in the famine at the time in the 1980s. So I had my 19th birthday over in Addis, and I just wanted to give something to the world before I went on my own ventures of academia. And Portsmouth Poly were the only people who said, send us a postcard. Everyone else said, no, you'll have to reapply. But Portsmouth said, send us a postcard. So, I am all about fate in life and serendipity. I mean, I enjoyed my time in Addis. I learnt a lot. I grew up, learnt about famine, about war, and you'll see how that comes back later
yeah.
in my
So
story.
so that the story starts in Addis Ababa, basically you with some values, basically.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
sent off with some values
Yeah.
in baggage. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Working with various charities to try and get money, really, for people who were dying. Um, so I wasn't sort of out in the country, I was in the capital city. So,
Being in from coming out of UK into Addis Ababa, it's a remote location, a different world.
yeah, different
So
world, and,
what happened
poverty.
there that set you on this path on forensic psychology there?
Well, interestingly, also, so I experienced that. I experienced famine, death, saw my first dead body at sort of 18, going on 19. But prior to that, someone else had asked me this recently, and I wrote a blog about this, that my parents, unfortunately, as you know, passed away, both of them now, within the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And my mum was a woman's activist. So she was all about women's rights. But we traveled a lot as a family. And one of my trips to New York, and people always go to New York, they go to the typical tourist traps, they go to the Empire State Building, etc. My parents took me
Been
to the
there, done that.
exactly, but my parents took me to the UN building. And when
Ah,
people say they're taking their children to New York, I said, is the UN building on your list? Because it should be.
mm.
Because yes, all the other tourist traps that everyone does was exciting and, wonderful. But the thing at the age of about 14 that really hit me was the UN. Yeah, with that wonderful sculpture outside of
Yeah,
the gun, which was all twisted,
yeah, yeah.
um, with just the ideology of the UN. And that really hit me hard as a sort of a teenager, thinking, this is amazing that, this, I had to use my passport. I remember I had to, because it was a different country, but I'm in US. And all these things and what it stood for, what the UN stood for really hit my heart. So I took my son as well at the age of 14, because you have to book your place, you get taken around by someone who works with the United Nations, and they explain about social justice. They say about all the values of the United Nations, and that carved my path. That I wanted to do something for society. I wanted to do good, and I wanted to help.
And this was way before we have the 17 sustainability goals.
Yeah,
Now it's more easy to access this for everyone, and it's been a
yeah,
part of the agenda for
yeah,
many organizations and
yeah,
governments.
yeah.
The UN Manual for Criminal Investigations is being launched today.
I know.
Yeah,
And that is almost like a full circle.
yeah.
And the new rapporteur, Alice, invited me to do some of the opening remarks about 3 or 4 weeks ago, regarding how we can sort of cope with females primarily who have been violated as part of war conflict.
Hmm.
And it's almost like my circle has come round
Yeah.
from being inspired by the UN and my mum, a women's activist, to suddenly doing a lot more work that I'm doing with the UN, on war crimes, etc. And I feel very blessed that, in fact, my passion is giving everyone a voice, whoever they are, to give them a voice, to let them be heard, is really coming to fruition. So yeah, that was my motivation, was
Ah,
going to the UN building.
oh, it's good start. So tell me, so there's a leap from visiting the UN
Mm,
building to, in 1999, you and Ray Bull wrote one of the first, maybe the
yeah.
first book on investigative interviewing, and coincidentally, as the manual is released today,
Mm,
and it talks a lot about investigative interviewing. What led you to come together, and what
yeah,
inspired you guys to write this book,
yeah,
and what talk
I
about that
know.
a little bit?
It's,
Yeah.
it is, I feel very, very, I keep saying this, but I do feel very privileged, the people I've worked with over the years. So, didn't get my grades. So I ended up going to Portsmouth Polytechnic.
Ah,
And Ray Bull came as head of department in my year 2, and he was a breath of fresh air. He was very different to a normal academic, was Ray. We both come from sort of quite working class backgrounds. Both of us are first in our families to um, do a degree. And I started working with him on my dissertation. As you know, I call him dad number 2. And he is like my dad number 2. So I did my undergrad dissertation with him on facial disfigurement and people's perceptions of children with facial disfigurement. So very different to obviously forensic interviewing. And then he had a PhD place, and I was very lucky, right place, right time. What he said to me, I was, relatively bright, I wasn't getting first, but he picked me because he knew I'd be able to talk to cops and I'd be able to interact with practitioners. Um,
So
he says
already
different.
here we could see that the interacting with other humans is a key.
Yeah, for me,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
always has been. Um, and justice for everyone, regardless. So, yes, so I started my PhD with Ray, and we started looking at, he had just written the first ever guidance in the world for interviewing vulnerable groups called the Memorandum of Good Practice. And everything that was written was based on some form of research base. Now we all call it evidence-based policing, but that didn't exist then. We always, as psychologists, everything we advised at a local or a national or an international level has to be based on research. That's
Hmm.
exactly what that manual being launched today, represents. But Ray drilled that into me back in 1992. That's when I started my PhD with Ray, and he'd just written this national guidance, and there was very limited research to base any guidance on how to interview vulnerable groups. uber vulnerable, children with learning disabilities and adults with learning disability. And so that was my focus of my research for 5 years. But within the first year, I said, I need to find out what police do. If I'm going to be researching the police for the next, it meant to be 3 years full time, um, then I need to find out what they did.
Mm.
So the local police, and back in 92, it was quite closed. It wasn't now quite an open organisation, the police in the UK, but in the early 90s, it was quite a closed organisation. And the local police, called Dorset Police, opened their arms and said, yeah, come and view, just come and observe what we do with child protection cases. And I learnt a lot. And then also, I was very lucky. I went over to LA to work with Ed Geiserman um, in the lab with Ed, because I was going to research this thing called the cognitive interview.
Yeah.
And in those days, to be able to research it, you had to be trained by the person who created it. So I worked with Ed in his lab, and I was like a kid in a sweet shop. And I met the local police officer, someone called Rick Pack, who asked Ed and Ron, how can we interview people properly? And it's always, and that taught me really early back in 92. It really taught me that it has to be a collaboration. So I met with Rick to find out why he'd approached his local university to try and come up with some interviewing models help when he interviews witnesses and victims on major crime. Because he said there was stuff left in the head, but he didn't know how to access it without, as I always say, tramping on the snow,
Mm.
contaminating the snow. So I learned very early from the police themselves, Dorset Police, and then working with Ed and meeting the LAPD, that this has to be a collaboration. It can't be just one-sided. It's a real world problem.
Yeah. How was it back then? Because you say that there was no real science back then, and now we know that science-backed research is good for building methods. But some of the stories we get is that back then you need to be either you were a people person or you weren't.
Yeah.
So there was if you didn't manage to connect well with people and intuitively, and then how was the perception of building science to this?
Yeah, and also, well, it's just understanding how science can help. I think as
Mm,
an academic, I like to call myself an acapracker, an academic practitioner, because as you
yeah.
know, I work on many a case. Um, but as an academic at that time, I didn't know much about the practitioner world in the early days. And that's what I invite all academics is to learn that practitioner role so they can become more of an
Mm,
acapracker. I see a lot of research, which to be honest, would never work in the field.
mm,
So it's obviously they haven't had any dialogue with what the real world problems are. Um, and So that's why I immersed myself. I just stayed in someone's house, and she was in child protection, her husband was in CID, and I just made tea, coffee, did filing cabinets just to find out what the real world problems were and how psychology, I'd only just come out of undergrad, how psychology can help their world. And there was a case with vulnerable adults that Ray Bull was asked to advise on. A large number of adults had been allegedly at that time abused physically, emotionally, sexually within a care home and situation. And the Thames Valley Police asked Ray um, to give him advice. And that was my first time working actually on a case, but obviously just helping Ray. And I learnt how difficult the job is. So yes,
mm,
we can be critical. I am a critical friend. That's what the police call me. However, I learnt what a difficult job it was in my first year of my PhD. And that the police on the whole are desperate for help in certain difficult cases. I was very lucky that I have been most of the time, not always, but most of the time embraced across the globe, asking for my help and Ray's help, and that's all we can be is help. We can't give them the magic wand, but we can be there to help um, and give advice. So I learned a lot about, my God, how difficult it is to get accurate, reliable
mm,
information from a vulnerable person um, to make an informed decision. And that's basically my world. My world is I work with decision makers, be they judges, prosecutors, be they police officers, who make a decision. And we know decisions are only as good, and people have heard me say this so many times, decisions are only as good as the information. Information is only as good as the questions. Poor questions results in poor information, results in poor, ill-informed, worst case scenario, miscarriages of justice decisions. And it's as simple as that, really. And that's what working on that case, and that, getting that inaccurate information is hard. So I learned very early that collaboration is needed. We need to find the gap. We need to understand the difficulty in the workplace. We need to then look at how we as psychologists, and obviously now other disciplines, but me as a psychologist, can try and help fill that gap and help the people. And be critical, of course, because part of the way is you have to be critical, but in a way that doesn't put up barriers. You always come up with solutions if possible.
So you guys in 99, you put all these learnings and into a book.
Yeah. Well, in 92, that's when I started my PhD, and 92 is the real year.
Yeah.
Everything happened in the UK in 92. Peace was born in 92.
Yeah, exactly.
I started my PhD in 92. Ray wrote the National Guide with someone called Di Birch, a lawyer, of how to interview vulnerable groups in 92. So everything stemmed from that year 92. And I was very lucky. I was on the fringes, because I was learning, of that world of collaboration. All these people were working together. And I got my PhD in 97. And then I was asked to write. So I got my doctorate in 97. But interesting, in 95, that's why it took me a bit longer, I was asked to be a lecturer in the Institute of Police and Criminological Studies, it was called then. We've now gone through 2 name changes. And it was the first ever police degree in the world. So this also is important. So I have always immersed myself in working with the practitioner. So then, as my first ever academic job, it wasn't the straight from school type of student. It was police officers. And police officers, who I love working with, were also very challenging to me, going, well, we're paying for this degree, or someone is paying for this degree and time. Why are we learning all this? So they made me as a psychologist go, why am I teaching them stress management? Why am I So it made me have to really conform all my knowledge to their world, not just interviewing, everything. And I led that degree for over 8 years. And we had people from all over the world. Initially, it was just Metropolitan Police, then it went national, then it went international. And so my academic sort of admin role, my teaching role, my PhD has always immersed me of dealing straight with a practitioner. Luckily, I'd say, because I've had to learn to go, yeah, what's the point? Why are we doing this?
Exactly, yeah.
Everyone always says that. Becky always says, what's the point? So at conferences, I'm there, what's the point? How are we going to
You're
put
that
this in the
annoying
world?
person asking those hard questions.
Well, I just say, how are we going to realize this in the real world?
Yeah.
How is this workable?
Yeah, I love it, because it is key, because it's sometimes, academia can work with topics that might hard to relate to practical situations, and our police officers are practical people. They have practical problems to solve. Yeah.
And now, luckily, we have this impact agenda in our research exercise. So suddenly I became the annoying person of going, oh, she's very applied. Yeah. And I work, my research is in what we call the sort of very messy data world, which is difficult to publish because you can't control everything, to suddenly being flavor of the month, to be honest, because suddenly, oh my God, Becky actually does work in the real world and says that really difficult question. I've always said it. What's the point? And, we now call it sort of impact is the buzzword. What's the impact? What's the impact? And that's why the book. And that book helped me broaden my horizons from vulnerable victims and witnesses to more suspects. I wrote a chapter on conversation management. It was an authored book.
Just recently, somebody recommended this book. Now, 25 years later. So why do you think that's the case, that it's still relevant? And also, what do you see has changed in the world? 25 years, science has evolved, practitioners evolved. So
Yeah,
what do you see changing in the world now? And with
25 years is a long time, huh? And things have changed, and some things haven't, which isn't great either.
mm,
I sometimes think, God, I've been dedicating 30 years of my life to this. Why? um, so what ha- what has stayed the same is a lot of the models have stayed the same, but they just have developed. And the reason why I think people still recommend it, because Ray and I, at the outset, back to that collaboration, wanted it not to be this really highbrow academic book. We wanted something that practitioners can pick up and use.
mm,
And that was really important for us. But my PhD students, majority of them have been practitioners. They learn a little bit from me and I learn a lot from them.
mm,
And they have also helped me understand their world with their own research. And that's been very important. So at the time, I had Colin Clark, who was my first PhD baby. I had Andy Griffiths, and they obviously were practitioners. And so I learned a lot from them. And so they also taught me how to try and put what we needed across so practitioners could pick it up.
mm,
And that's what was really important. And Tom Williamson, as you know, who led the whole initiative of um, investment interviewing in the UK, um, he organized a conference in Paris, and every European country were asked to talk about what their interviewing stance was. This was many moons ago. And the only country that took academics was the UK, and that was Ray and I. And it was quite embarrassing in a way, because most countries just said, "Oh, we've got this book," and it was our book.
ah,
And that wasn't because it was so brilliant. It was because there was nothing else. So a
ah,
lot of countries utilized that book because that's all they had. They could see the tide turning from this sort of very narrow-minded interrogation stance within Europe to more an open-minded, ethical, effective interviewing model. They could
mhm,
see that tide turning. And that's what's changed in 25 years within the
yeah,
suspect world, is a real shift, but not all countries, as we know.
exactly. So we've already talked to Ivar Fausing and Aspen Rutledge. So they took their inspiration out of some of the early work from the UK
Mm,
into Norway, and
yeah,
then there is spreading around to some parts of the world, but not everyone.
no.
Why do you think that is? That it's not picked up by everyone.
It's not picked up by everyone. I think some countries just don't know that it
Ah,
exists. So I think it's a lack of understanding that there is this whole new world. I go around the world talking to various countries, as does Eva and
mm,
as Bjorn, and sometimes we all do it together, which is great fun, as you can imagine. Um, and so I think some countries are just enlightened.
mm.
Oh my, that this whole new world has opened up. Um, However, it is a hard change, because changing is not just changing the model, it's not just changing um, training packages, it's changing mindsets, and trying to change the hearts and minds and the mindsets is a big ship to turn.
Is it, would you say it's counterintuitive from a human nature point of view, in when we talk with other people? We so, you know, it seemed to me that we so often get into a bias or confirmation bias. We think we have solved the thing.
Yeah.
As humans, we want to jump to conclusions because
Yeah,
that's
and
the
we like to be
easiest.
right. And
Yeah.
human beings like to be right. There's a number of things going on, I think, within the world of investigation and interviewing. I think, first of all, if you look at communication, the basic communication skills, of course, there are cultural differences on top, but basic memory, basic communication, that, our everyday conversation skills is, we overtalk, we interrupt, we've both done that with each other because we get on and we know each
Mm,
other, Borg, and therefore we have rapport,
yeah.
right? And this, we know rapport is the heart of good interviewing. And if you use your everyday conversational skills, which is using leading questions, closed questions. In fact, if I said to you, did you have a good holiday? And I know that I don't want war and peace. I just want, yes, it was great. these conversational rules, these basic conversational rules do not fit in an investigative interviewing context.
Mm.
That's the problem. So in the investigative interviewing world, we need police officers to be open, open with regarding their conversational skills, allowing people to run for 45, 50 hours in the adult
Mm.
witness
Mm.
world, which is not, it's not a conversation. You said it was a conversation with a purpose. It's actually not.
Mm.
In the adult witness world, primarily, it's a one-way flow, which
Mm.
goes against all our rules and regulations. So there's a whole problem of it's actually going against the curve of everyday conversation. So therefore, we need good training. We also need techniques to help the police give that to, such as the cognitive interview. That's what it's all about, to explain to general public to basically go against their everyday conversational rules. But because we're teaching police officers to go against it, they then have to also have a lot of refresher training. So that's costly. So you've got that going on. And we know work that Lawrence Allison's also done. We all know that to get transference into the workplace, you need a lot of practice in small groups. So
Mm.
it costs money, time, energy. It's very costly.
It's not easy, and it's costly, and so
Yeah.
yeah.
That's the one side. The other side is your decision-making processes. And
Yeah.
so the more the brain is overloaded, the more the brain will use shortcuts. Now, we just talked about that interviewing is very difficult. So you have that real cognitive overload of the brain, yeah, of the actual interviewer. And the more it's overloaded, therefore, the more likely you're going to be biased.
Mm.
And that's where your world hits technology,
Yeah.
right? And that's where tech should be able to free up some of that cognitive
Mm.
load of an interviewer. And, if someone says, what is, when we do gigs in new countries, what is the one thing you should change? And I say, start recording,
Yeah.
start using technology, not only for transparency in the process, and therefore you can make sure it is fair, etc., and human rights angle, but from a psychologist's perspective, to free up the cognitive load of the interview.
Exactly.
And that's key, you know. And we can understand then what's happened in that interaction. So we can then see what's going wrong. We can then feed that into training. There's a whole range of reasons that why we need to record. And for me, that's your first message. Just start recording these interactions. And the majority of countries around the world do not.
Mm.
And that is scary. We've done it since
Yeah.
1984 with our suspect interviews. It's more complicated with our witness interviews in the UK. But
So that brings me on another topic, which I think is near and dear to you. So there's disciplines around suspect interviews and how you work on that, but you've chosen vulnerable witnesses as your primary focus, at least lately.
yeah.
Why did you go that route? And
One, that was my PhD with Ray, actually. That's where I
yeah.
started with children. But also, I've done a lot of work more recently with adults in terror attacks. I've worked as an advisor to the United Kingdom counterterrorism team on terror attacks since 2017 and other cases. And I've also been part of giving advice to war crimes teams across the globe. And so one key question is what is vulnerability? We keep using this word. I mean, there is no universal definition of vulnerability. It's really difficult. I mean, that's a PhD in itself. What is vulnerability? So for me, when we start looking at that big question of what vulnerability is, you have what we call internal vulnerability, who you are. So, when you say to the general public who's vulnerable, of course, they'll say children, older adults, people, have some form of mental disorder, they're the internal. So of course we need to, and we know the model of interviewing, and to get accurate, reliable information from people within that sphere, we have to be even more careful of how we gather that information to make informed decisions. And therefore it has to be a transparent process. And we've had that with our children since 1989 in the UK. That's key. But then you also have external vulnerability. So that is the circumstance you might have been thrown into, whether that's a sexual offence, and that is something I'm really focusing on at the moment, or whether that is because of a terror attack.
Mm.
Primarily, you're not targeted, wrong place, wrong time, but you're still part of a trauma or even a disaster, right? So trauma externally will still impact, and our emergency responders themselves are part of that. And for me, I one of my students worked looking at how we responded to the terror attack in Norway. Patrick Reisen's work looked at how the police officers managed trauma, and his amazing work was fed straight into the work of the United Kingdom counterterrorism. It's a country to country learning. It's
Mm.
amazing. And they even read some of his papers before they did some of their interviews. So, I mean, that's impact,
Mm.
learning from, an awful situation, from one awful to another. And I'm going over to Australia actually in August, and they've obviously just had one, haven't they? And so looks like I might be having meetings about what we've created here. It's called whiskey. I tried to put gin in there, Borg, but no. And when I saw you in London, we'd just been selling whiskey to the Irish in the Irish embassy. And whiskey is a framework, which is witness interview strategies for critical incidents. It's the starter for 10 of how to triage mass witnesses.
Mm.
And so for me, vulnerability comes from a whole host of internal and external factors. And the balance in all these cases, whether it's a victim of war crimes, whether it's a sexual offence victim, our investigation of sexual offences in the UK is, it's not great. I think the last figure was around 2%. And we've luckily had someone called Betsy Stanko, an amazing professor, leading this Operation Satyria, which has been a massive, massive initiative in the UK with lots of wonderful people working on it, all trying to increase the investigation of sexual offences in the UK. I've had a little part of that by working with Patrick Tidmarsh, and we've been morphing the whole story approach that he works on with the ECI, the Enhanced Cognitive Interview, and we have just come up with a new model of interviewing together, collective, both of us, and of how to interview sexual offence victims to try and improve that balance between getting accurate, reliable information to make an informed decision,
Mm.
but in a trauma-informed approach. And that balance is really difficult
Yeah, because
sometimes to forge.
you're dealing with psychological complex matters. So how do you train people? And in the UK you call this achieving best evidence, right?
We do, yes, and I've been
And
part of, achieving best evidence is based on research. It's been written over the years by a multitude of people. It initially was Ray. Ray wrote the Memorandum of Good Practice, which is just for children and child abuse cases. And then there was a big campaign, and it was a Speaking Up for Justice report saying why just children allowed a video recorded interview or evidence in chief. And that widened the loop to have people with learning disability, mental disorder, physical disability, and children up to the age of 18 allowed a visually recorded interview as their evidence in chief. And that was a real big, important initiative. But suddenly it's like, whoa, these interviews are open to public scrutiny.
mm,
These interviews are high, they need people who are highly skilled. And hence my PhD was starting to look at that world. And it's a difficult task because you've got trauma, you've got vulnerability, and also even today, there's discussion in the UK about what this visually recorded interview should look like.
mm,
And I know not everyone's happy with that product. And the reason why not everyone's happy is this product, which is one product. So you basically interview a vulnerable group, and that is their evidence in chief in our courts. That product has to serve a multitude of needs. And I put this to people the other day, and they said, right, you need to write that down. And this is where, again, it's finding this balance of, so first of all, this product, which we obviously record, has to serve the memory need.
mm,
And what I mean the memory need the model that elicits it, which is in achieving best evidence, has to have accurate, reliable information to make an informed decision.
Mm.
And we know through lab research and lots of research, I'm an expert witness, that if you follow this model, you're going to get reliable information, which we can make an informed decision on, right? So
Yeah.
this product has to serve the memory need. It also has to serve the victim need, i.e., it has to be in a way that we don't ransack people's memories,
Mm.
yeah, and re-traumatize them. So it has to be trauma informed. Okay, so these are two things, and that's primarily what achieving best evidence focused on: the memory and the trauma. And the trauma has come over time when we've learned more and more about what trauma is and how to approach it. Then it also has to serve a police need. Police officers are decision makers, so, and they're also gatekeepers. So it has to serve a police decision making need. Then we have our Crown Prosecution Service in the UK. It has to serve their need, and their need as decision makers prior to court. Do we take it to court or not? But also, if they decide that this should go to a court, it then has to serve as something that CPS believes is a good product for them. This is where the disconnect has been, and it's not solved, I would say. Personally,
Okay.
that's my
Yeah.
own. But then it also has to serve, yeah, a jury needs in the UK.
There's a
You know,
lot going into this bag here now, right?
in this one interview,
Yeah.
and can we have a one size fits all approach? I think we can, but it's difficult. But also, we've got to think about is at the moment, people don't understand each other's roles. So people seem to be just shifting blame, may be the wrong word, but people who are debating what this should look at are looking at, well, me as a prosecutor need this, right?
Mm.
Police go, me as a police officer need this, without actually thinking about, actually, this product needs to serve a multitude of people. Let's look at everyone's
So
viewpoint.
proper training, understanding of the various stakeholders, but also proper preparations.
Planning and
Key
prep,
here.
course board, and it all comes down to planning and prep and needs assessment of the individual, the victim, and the case, and where we're going with it is really key, because, as we keep saying, it's a blooming difficult task, and what's scary is most people around the world aren't trained to do it,
Exactly.
which is
How,
scary.
yeah. How do we change the world? How,
That's
you
another
guys
big,
have,
big question.
yeah.
Oh no, it's a very well. Luckily, we have the COST project
Yeah.
with the Implemendes work going on, which most of us are involved in. Dave Walsh is spearheading that very admirably, and I think there are now up to 47 countries involved in implementing the Mendes principles. That we know with the Mendes principles, that is all about the international change, you know, and this is, when I work with countries, they normally ask me these two things: how can we get open-minded investigators who are competent communicators?
Mm.
And most countries want to have a justice system that service that need. So, whether it's the prosecutors who do most of the interviews, that happens in some countries. I've got a judge, Mayra. She's a Brazilian judge working with me, and she makes judicial decisions. So her PhD is looking at how do we make effective judicial decisions in her Brazilian justice system, again, with child interviews. So it's really important, I think, for us to look at each country in context, because each country will have different issues too. They can learn from us in the UK and hopefully overcome 10 years by going, don't go down that rabbit hole. But it has to be in their own cultural context.
30 years later, we now are launching the UN manual, the Mendes principles coming along. Some 40 countries participating. It's starting to become a movement here.
It is. And, that's one thing of having lots of PhD children, and they spread the word. and then they also have some of them will go on and have PhD students themselves. So I think it's really important educating um, the policing world, because Eva and Asbjorn, they came over to do their masters and went on to do PhDs, and they have made great waves in Norway. So they have had this major. So I've been lucky because I created, I was part of running that first ever police degree. Um, and so I've worked with amazing practitioners. They learn a little bit from me. I learn a lot from them. And every day's a school day, Borg, every
Yeah,
day.
yeah.
And the day I don't learn is the day I die. I
So
love it.
what's your yeah? So what's your learning plan going forward then? 30
Forward,
years
the
has
future.
passed, and then there's
Yeah,
what is the future? Where are you aiming your sights and
yeah, I know.
research?
As everyone says, I've got to learn to say no, because I say yes to too many things, because I get so excited about too many projects. Um, so one is, doing whatever I can for the UN,
Mm,
and implement theirs, and working hopefully more with um, the anti-torture committee, etc. I'd love to work more and more in that area. I've been a single parent. My son is now in his 20s, so I have more free time, as in to move, rather than thinking, right, okay, I've been asked to go here. As a single parent, I've always had to have that in mind. Um, so I'd love to work more and do a lot of the work we've learned on the war crimes team.
mm.
There's been a lot of learning over the last 5 years. So that's sort of one area, is the war
And it's an
crimes work,
area that as we talk,
unfortunately.
it becomes it becomes more and more relevant war crimes being appeared.
Unfortunately, I wish I wasn't needed in that sphere.
Mm,
I wish I wasn't needed. And that's the thing. As a researcher, you're looking for the research gap. You're always looking for, where's the research gap. And there's a big gap in what we know about dealing with victims of
mm.
war crimes. Unfortunately, there's a massive gap, and unfortunately, that needs filling. So that's one area. Sexual offences is another one. We just don't get it right, um, and we need to get it right for victims going forward, men and women. Really important. So, but also the sort of another area is practitioners themselves. Um, I've seen so many practitioners in the terror attacks, who, in many countries, who have seen awful things. And I know it's part of their job, but no one expects to see the trauma in these terror. It's above and beyond. That's why they're called a critical incident.
Mm,
It's difficult to prepare them for that. And they need to have proper, um, we need resilience, and there is training of resilience. But most of these are frontline officers, they're new in service, they're fresh out of the box, a lot of them. And we need to deal with them properly. And in the past, they've been told to write their own statements. And for me, that's not good enough. They need to properly cognitively process their own trauma.
mm.
And in the UK, that's what we've been focusing on as well, is part of our triaging mass witnesses. We also put into that the frontline
Mm,
responders too. And I'm shying away, say, people, please, they're human beings too.
mm.
And don't get them to write their own statements. This is just not good enough practice. And unfortunately, that happens too many times across the globe. These are people who are meant to be helping us.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let us help
The-
them too.
Exactly.
So for me, that's another message, is we need to look after our frontline too. They're protecting us. We need to protect them to enable them to protect us. At the moment, I don't think that's being done enough. So that's another one. That's another one of my. So yeah, at the moment, those are the sort of the key areas, I think.
So even though what we talk about here is professionalism, I can see in your eyes when you talk, it's more than professionalism. This is a passion. It's a
Yeah.
passion project for you.
It is, and people say, "Will you ever retire?" And I'm hoping I'd be like my mentor, my dad, number two. I hope I'll be in that privileged position that I can do that too. And as I said, every day is a school day, and it does it. Seeing the legacy coming through, and it is, thank goodness. There was a handful of us initially, and now the world, it's growing and growing. The world of investigative interviewing, which is just brilliant. And when we were in Combra recently as part of Implement Days, you know, me and Ray were both there looking at each other. And it's just so nice. Before we could count us on the hand.
Yeah.
And now, you know, it's a room full of people all excited about Implement and Mend. It's so inspiring. It's lovely.
So,
It just think,
the family of people working
yeah,
on and researching investigative interviewing
and it
is
is a
growing
family.
rapidly. Yeah.
And it is a family, and I think you know that. So you've been part of it as well, and we've worked with you for a while.
Mm.
Um, and you know, it is a family.
It's a good point to end this conversation on. Yes, always, Becky. I can feel the energy flowing through the computer, even if we are in remote locations. It's always a treat talking to you, and
Oh, it's
the,
lovely to
the
see.
the passion projects that you have is changing the world. So
Oh,
big
thank
thank
you.
you for that.
Thank you for your time, Bob.